Hi, good afternoon. My name is Allison Bainbridge, and it's my privilege to welcome you to Book Passages conversation with two amazing authors today. Before we begin, I just want to put a plug in for independent bookstores. At this time of gift shopping, books are a great gift. You can find something for everyone. And I know people are joining us from all over the country. So I want to encourage, actually implore you to please do your book shopping at independent bookstores. It's so necessary for us. This is our big time that supports the bookstore often for the rest of the year. We need them to continue to be a valuable part of your communities. You can support Book Passive virtual programs that we offer. We offer these for free, but we still could definitely, we appreciate the support of your buying books to keep this program going. Um, you can order online, or if you're local, please drop by. We really appreciate it. Okay, so I want to start off. I'm not a baseball fan, and I don't usually use sports analogies. However, as I was thinking about this event today and what I was going to say, it was funny. What came up in my mind was that we have two heavy hitters for an incredible. It's like a double header. We have two authors talking about two fabulous new books. Our authors, Alice McDermott and Lisa Gornick, will be discussing their latest fictional novels, Absolution and Anna Turns. Absolution is a riveting account of women's lives on the margins of the Vietnam War. Anna Turns is a kaleidoscopic story unspooling over the 24 hours of a very contemporary woman's 60th birthday. Both are from very different times and perspectives, and yet they both give you an insight into the souls of women, of a woman. Alice McDermott, one of our most observant, most affecting writers, talks about folly and grace, obligation, sacrifice, and finally the quest for absolution in a broken world. Alice is a prize-winning author of 8 novels, 3 of which were nominated for a Pulitzer. She's also an essayist of works that have appeared in multiple publications, and she's currently a professor at Johns Hopkins. From Lisa Gornick's novel, Gazing out at the dark moat of Central Park from behind her desk, Anna sees that she can no longer postpone making peace with her past or confronting her present. This is a really powerful story of a woman coming into her own. Lisa has been hailed by NPR as one of the most perceptive, compassionate writers of fiction in America, immensely talented and brave. For many years, I thought this was so interesting. She was a practicing psychotherapist and psychoanalyst. It seems unusual for a fiction writer to have that background. She currently is a professor in psychotherapy. She's written 5 novels, and her work has appeared in multiple publications as well. If you have any questions for our authors, we're going to have a Q&A, so please put them in the chat session, and we'll try to get to all of them. And now, please give a warm virtual welcome to Alice and Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Lisa and I agreed I would start our conversation with a short reading, and Lisa will do the same. I just recalled listening to Allison's wonderful introduction, and I do second, please support your independent bookstores. They're our little cathedrals of sanity and hope for so many communities. But when she was talking about our 2 books, Lisa and mine, I was reminded many years ago, over 20, when my novel Charming Billy received the National Book Award. A rather prestigious male novelist told me at the time that women writers get literary awards when their books are about men. And since then, there's some evidence that might bear that out, but I think he offered it as advice, but I sort of took it as a challenge, and time again, I've thought, no, I'm just going to write about women. I think I can do that. Absolution is indeed about the Vietnam War, or at least 1963, the year that led up to it. But it's not about the soldiers. It's about the wives of men who were sent over there doing their nefarious things at the time. It's about women, it's about daughters, it's about mothers. So I'm just going to read a little section that takes place in Saigon. Charlene is a corporate wife. Trisha is a young newlywed married to a up and coming young lawyer who is in Saigon on loan to Navy intelligence. And early in her tenure there, Trisha has a miscarriage. And this is the scene. Charlene said she had looked for me at the ambassador's reception, found Peter, my husband, who told her I was under the weather. And then, of course, she saw him leave with Dr. Navy. Don't go back to that guy, Charlene said, next time around. The last thing you want is a Navy doctor. They hardly know what they're looking at. They get your feet in those stirrups and their ears between your knees, and suddenly it's all up periscope. They spend the rest of the exam trying to figure out what's port and what's starboard, wondering where the hell the penis is. I smiled, still shocked, but growing less so by Charlene's use of words. When Min Lin, our servant, came in with her tray, more tea for us both, she asked me if I would like some eggs, and Charlene replied, "Good God, no," which was my sentiment exactly. I was happy to let her speak for me. Min Lin poured the tea and handed us each a cup. I saw her glance into the bathroom. She seemed about to go in to tidy up when Charlene said something to her in quick French about the miscarriage, I supposed. Min Lin paused, then glanced at me, then nodded. She said softly, "I understand." She went out with her tray, but returned later with another joss stick and what looked to me at first like a small gray stone. She lit the stick and placed it in the little sand-filled pail where we burned our incense, and then she placed the stone before it. It was, in fact, a small, smiling Buddha. Sharp-eyed Charlene, smarter than everyone, said, "Jizo?" And Min Lin shook her head. "Daijiang," she whispered. Charlene nodded. "Very sweet," she said. "Thank you." When Min Lin left again, Charlene looked at me and frowned. She did not like to be corrected. "Same difference," she said. "It's Jizo in Japan, Dizang here, a bodhisattva, protector of travelers, but also of stillborn or miscarried children. Very sweet of her." Charlene told me that she and Kent were in Tokyo when she miscarried after the twins. A Japanese friend had given her a similar little statue. She was 5 months along. "I'm sorry," I said, but Charlene shrugged and sipped her tea. "Poor little thing was a mess," she said, "hadn't developed right at all. She looked like a glove turned inside out, a little monstrous," and tossed off a small laugh. "Although I guess that's true of us all. Inside out, we're all monsters." She shrugged again, nodded towards the bathroom. "Mother Nature disposes." And then she added, "The bitch." I was strangely comforted by this. I had not yet taken into consideration that there had been an imperfection. Or if I had, I believed the imperfection was mine. "Apparently, Jizo or Dizang," Charlene was saying, "watches out for the little souls that have not lived long enough to accumulate good deeds, who can't cross over into the spirit world, permanently neither here nor there, left only to pile stones endlessly on the edge of the riverbank. Just this side of the river Styx, I guess you could say, what you Catholics call limbo. Not exactly purgatory, because there's no hope for change." "How sad," I said. Charlene squinted at me through the smoke. "It gets worse. It's a limbo without mercy. Apparently there are demons in this place on the riverbank. I guess so the little ones don't get deluded into thinking they're in heaven. The demons torment these lost souls, scatter their piled stones. Jizo Daizang protects them, hides them under his robes, a hint of benevolence in a place of eternal stasis. She paused, picked some tobacco from her tongue, or some such, she added. As I understand it, Jesus a Bodhisattva rather than a Buddha because he's elected to serve the underworld before reaching enlightenment himself, a kind of martyr, I guess, assigned to the saddest and most futile of projects, doing whatever good he can for these hopeless ones. What inconsequential good? I saw her rub her thumb and ring finger together under her cigarette, a sign I was beginning to learn of her own quick thoughts, or something like that. Charlene went on, suddenly dismissive. Buddhism is charming, but I can't say I truly get it. Min Lin's a Catholic, I told her. Charlene shook her head. So's Madame Nu. But she was a Buddhist first. She squinted again. Or maybe Min Lin finds it politically expedient these days to call herself a Catholic with all that's going on. I knew this was possible, but still I said, I've seen her at Mass. Charlene laughed her laugh. Well then, Tricia, you've been given your first little Buddha by a Roman Catholic. And then she added, softening, but that's Vietnam, a mishmash. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Alice. And I'm so glad you read that passage, both because we were talking about it earlier, but also because it seems to me that it embodies something really important that I'm sure we'll talk about later, which is the way that Charlene does not turn away from things. So many women would and do to this day avoid talking about miscarriage. And when Charlene suspects that Trisha has miscarried, she rushes over to be there with her and does not in any way shirk from talking about it, very frankly. And okay, so I'm going to tell you, and thank you, thank you, Allison, for the kind introduction and book passage for having us here and all of you who are listening. I'll tell you just a little bit about my book, and then I'm going to read shortly too. Anna Turns, as Allison said, takes place on a woman's 60th birthday, and it is a very complicated day for her. She wends her way through the city. She has yoga with her quarreling nieces, and then she goes to the Met to meet her transitioning adult child, and the Harlem brownstone of her gonzo journalist lover. Central Park, she crosses with her pot-addicted daughter to join a dinner that's being hosted by her self-made brother, who has, she thinks, hijacked her father's will. And anyway, it goes on, and we turn away from Anna's point of view at several times during the novel to enter into other consciousness. But what I'm going to read from now is the very beginning of the book, which takes place at midnight on Anna's birthday, and then I'll jump ahead to midday when she meets her transitioning adult child at the Metropolitan Museum. Midnight. The second hand on the Museum of Modern Art desk clock arrives at the 12 to align with the minute and hour arrows so that for an instant the three form a vector pointed heavenward, shepherding in my 60th birthday. The clock was a rare gift from my father, Rolf, dead this past year, who never remembered my birthday. My mother, Jean, never forgets. Of late, she's memorialized the day with an email sent at midnight. More cyber attack, italicized and bolded fonts, hyperlinks, capitalized text, than Hallmark emotions. Now, my mother's latest birthday email sits atop my inbox with calculations as the subject. Can I delete it unopened? For God's sake, I'm 60 years old. Am I not the sentry for my own mind? I open it. Anna, on your 60th birthday, it seems appropriate to share the following, all caps, calculations that I made 20 years ago regarding the inflation-adjusted sum of money I spent on you. 1, people never realize how, all caps, very costly it is to raise a child. 2, if this information were more widely available, the birth rate would undoubtedly be lower and our economy more prosperous. 3, I plan to write a letter to the New York Times on this subject. 4, 20 years ago, the number I calculated for the amount I spent raising you was $56,000. Had I invested that money starting on at your birth, rather than spending it year by year on you, it would have grown with compound interest to nearly, all caps, $250,000. All of which is to say, being a parent is a great sacrifice. Mom/G. I bury my head in my arms, the words detonating, my adult self imploding. No, I tell myself. No, no, and no. A few hours later, I'm seated in the lobby's circular bench, absorbed in Clarissa Dalloway's response to Lady Bruton having invited Clarissa's husband, but not her, to luncheon, when Simon kisses my cheek. Happy birthday, Mom. The changes in Simon from the feminizing therapy have been gradual, but slowly a ravine has widened between the person who announced last October they know in their soul they're a woman, and the graceful creature standing in front of me in a turtleneck sweater with brows that look like they've been plucked and a chin with no sign of stubble. By the end of summer, they've told me they'll change their name to Simona and begin using female pronouns. With this news have come new worries. Will Simona be safe? What if she's in an accident and the ambulance crew cut off her clothes and discovers she's trans? What if one of them is transphobic? Will they still help her? Simon takes my arm as I stand. Sorry I'm late. Inga forgot I was taking you to lunch and scheduled a meeting with the series editor. They roll their eyes. I had to attend. While we walk through the Greek and Roman galleries to the restaurant, Simon tells me Inga now wants to incorporate debates about consciousness into her book on legal questions raised by reproductive technologies. I listen, letting my eyes wander over the marble statues, for centuries considered the embodiment of an Aryan ideal when, in fact, they'd originally been painted in a range of skin tones. Never before have I noticed the sheer quantity of male genitals in the galleries, depicted so sweetly and flower-like, smelling of stone, not man. I inhale deeply. We can only be as happy as our least happy child, Fiona is fond of saying. For both of us, our least happy child is our only child. With Simon, though, the saying isn't apt. Since declaring their intention to transition, Simon is not unhappy. My Clarissa Dalloway's daughter, who sees the horizon as infinite. She might be a doctor, a farmer, go into parliament, or she might be indolent and do none of the above. My child is excited about the changes ahead. Simon pauses at a terracotta statue of a woman seated on a boulder. Belief, they've explained, has nothing to do with their experience. They don't believe they're a woman. They are a woman. What's most challenging for me is what I know in my bones. I must not turn a deaf ear to the essential difference between believe, which presumes other possibilities, and is or are, with their full, transitive, equal sign, non-disputable force. I must not say anything that implies I understand who you are more than you do yourself. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. That's beautiful. Lisa and I were talking before we showed up here about would it be okay if we spent a little time talking about craft. For many years at Johns Hopkins, I taught a writing workshop in the short novel, in which students would write an original short novel and read many. And to make that doable for them, I gave my students 3 categories, structured categories, to use when trying to shape a short novel. And the first one was a day in the life model, which of course Mrs. Dalloway, which you just referenced, is one of the best. The second would be an inciting incident novel. That is a novel that begins with a gunshot, with a stone thrown into a still pond. And then the third model would be the biographical novel, the history of a life, starting from the beginning and following it to some kind of end. But the day in the life was always the most appealing to my young students. And I think because they thought it sounded simple at first, and then they would understand how many challenges the structure put before them. So I'm really interested in, you say in your book that this was this novel was a very long time in coming. So I'm very interested in the decisions you had to make once you put that parameter of Anna turns, this is Anna's birthday, this is a Mrs. Dalloway type day in the life of a single woman, but there are so many choices that you had to make. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And well, I'm afraid I probably made the same mistake as your students did, thinking, oh, this will be easier. My last novel had a protagonist who was 101 years old, and it was sort of a combination of of what I call a tight frame novel. And there was the front story took place in a week, but interwoven, almost braided into it, was the story of this woman's life. And so it took place over a century, and I thought, I'm not going to cover a century again, and I'm going to constrict this novel to a day. And in fact, it is not an easy form. It forces one to have compression if, like we both do, we construct our characters with a lot of referencing to family history and to prior generations and the ways that prior generations impact current generations, which in fact happens a great deal in Absolution, where you have Rainey, the daughter of Charlene, the woman who you just heard about in the prior scene. So I started off at first thinking I was going to just write this as a day, from constricting myself to one point of view, Anna's point of view. And it was a much shorter novel than it is right now. And when I finished, I was still interested in the characters, and I began writing what I thought might be a companion book of outtakes of stories from other points of view. And I was talking about this with a friend, another writer friend, and a light bulb went off, and I thought, why do I have these as separate books? You know, why would a reader read one and then read the other? And it occurred to me that I could weave them together. And then, of course, I went overboard and I wove them together, and I thought, well, I'll just go forward another 4 years. So I ended up with a much longer book than what we have now, that jumped forward 4 years, and it had 7 other points of view.
Mhm.
And in any case, by the time I realized I wanted to come back and I needed to come back to the day frame, and that there were too many other chapters, it was a little bit like stone soup. What I had learned in writing all of those other points of view and that next 4 years really was able to be folded back in to the current story. So the novel at present, in its current form, involves one day, and there's a spine that runs through it. That is Anna's story, but interwoven are the stories from 5 other points of view, 4 of which, in fact, are from men. There's Anna's husband, her father, her brother, her lover, and then her lover's wife. And those are in a very different consciousness. And it really was only after I saw the book in physical form that I understood that the title itself predicted, in a sense, the structure. I had the title before I made this decision, in that the reader, turned away from Anna's point of view over and over again, which is one of, in a sense, maybe the moral thesis of the book, is the importance of trying to understand things from other points of view. And the reader, therefore, is often ahead of Anna in understanding things. In fact, it was really only today, I mentioned this to Alice before, that I realized how early in the book the reader learns that Anna's husband knows that she's been having an affair. So on page 40, I wasn't even aware of that myself. So the reader is way ahead of Anna in knowing that key information.
Can I just ask you, because you read that wonderful opening, the email from mom on your 60th birthday, you owe me, this is how much it cost. Did you ever think about writing a section from Anna's mother's point of view?
It's interesting. I did not. And part of that is because her mother is not really a person who knows herself
Mm.
very well. So, in fact, what Anna knows about her is perhaps deeper than what Jean, the mother, knows herself. But I want to flip the question now to you, Alice, and ask you about the structure of your book, which as we've talked about, I don't know that if I would have identified this myself, but it's really an inciting incident book, though we don't learn the inciting incident until about 4/5 of the way through or 3/4 of the way through. So tell me how you came upon your structure, and did you always know the inciting incident?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's sort of connected. I mean, the the novel is really a call and response. It's sort of a pseudo epistolary. It begins with Trisha answering a question, um, and evoking memories because someone has asked her a question. Do you remember me? Do you remember my mother? The question is not in the first pages of the book. The question itself is what the reader later discovers is the inciting incident. And in many ways, I think it connects to what you're saying about not writing from Jean's point of view in Anna Turns. Um, I, I knew that this was going to be a novel about a certain generation of women, that is, women who came of age in the 50s, who saw themselves as helpmeets to their successful husbands, who counted their own success by how well their husbands did in the world and by their abilities to take care of the household, to be good corporate wives, to be good wives of important men, to be the wives on the periphery of major events, quietly taking care of the home front in many ways. And I think I understood almost intuitively that these were women, much like Jean, who didn't know themselves very well, who were not of a generation who would
Mhm.
write their own memoirs, who would tell their own stories unless they were asked. And having lived 30 some odd years inside the Beltway, these were women I was very familiar with running into in all kinds of places. Women who, again, had fascinating careers in the shadow of their husbands' fascinating careers. So that if you ask them, why did you live in all these exotic places? What was it like to be in Saigon in 1963? They would say, I was just taking care of the children. I was just taking
Great.
care of the household. It was my husband who was doing interesting things. So I knew intuitively that a question had to have been asked of Trisha in order for her to begin to remember and to, in some ways, in telling the story of her memories of that time and place. She begins, as many of us do, this is the confessional aspect of storytelling. She
Mhm.
begins to reveal things I think she hadn't predicted, and perhaps hadn't even given the time herself to understand about herself. So it's very much that generation, like Anna's mother, of women who would not have been introspective, not for any lack of intelligence or ambition, but because they lived in a world where no one asked. Um, and they were and they would have made their own experience secondary to the experiences of either their spouses or their children. So that was the unasked question, not in the book, although revealed later, but the question that Trisha responds to when the novel begins.
Right. And so tell me about time in your novel. It's very interesting. Trisha is, I take it, in her early 80s when she is writing back to Rainey, who she first met when she was 7 or 8 years old. We learn that very early in the novel, and Rainey is in her late 60s at the time. So it's a they're reflecting back on things that happened in 1963, and to some extent another even earlier for Trisha, when she thinks back about her friendship with Stella, with a college friend. So tell me how time and memory work in your novel. And
Well, again, Lisa, we have many similarities. I mean, your Anna is taking stock. It's her 60th
right,
birthday. And as you said earlier, these are people who taking stock um, in, immediately involves a web of family, of parents, of people, grandparents, people who came before. And I suppose that's true of all of us if we're honest about it. No life takes place without all those connections in some way, um, changing the balance over the years. But this is definitely Trisha's Rainey's invitation to Trisha. Do you remember me? Do you remember my mother? Is Trisha's opportunity to look back at a very pivotal year through all she knows that has happened since. So I'm not the first to point this out. 1963 historically was an incredible year. Certainly in the history of the United States, we all think about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. 3 weeks before that, the Catholic president of Vietnam was assassinated. It was the year of the March on Washington. Medgar Evers was assassinated down south in 1963. Pope John the 23rd, who started the modernization of the Catholic Church, died in 1963. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963. So it's the real precipice. It's the precipice in Vietnam before America began to make all the tremendous missteps that it did. And before women began to wonder about their roles. So Trisha's aware of all that as she is recollecting for Rainey, who was a little girl at that time, what was going on in her own life. And again, in her life as a spouse and as a woman in that time and place. So knowing what was to come makes the recollection, I think, all that more poignant and ironic, but also leads to an opportunity for revelation. And you were mentioning that this is something that you're very familiar with in your role as a therapist. What
yes.
storytelling and memory can lead to.
No, when we were talking before, I mentioned to Alice that one of the things that always struck me as a therapist is that the initial story that a patient would tell when they came in, and that I would then form my own version, which was a different version often, was always overturned later in the treatment. So it was a question of different memories emerging, a different trusting relationship emerging, and mostly, hopefully, the patient changing in a way that they were able to rewrite their own story. The same thing happens for me as a writer, and I'm wondering if it does for you too, that I'll start off thinking certain things about characters, and they change. My ideas change about what these people are like, what the arcs of what's at stake for them, what the arc of their life is about. I don't think I started off this book thinking that forgiveness was going to be a major theme, and of course I did discover that. And but I want to come back to craft, because we started off talking about structure, and one of the things that I'm very struck with in your book, and that I like to do as well, is that we both do a lot of really minute physical descriptions in pretty compressed forms, but it was very fun in Absolution to be reading about what women wore in those days, the shirt waists, the garter belts, the girdles, all of this stuff that's just not part of anybody's lives anymore, but you and I certainly remember. And I'm wondering what role those physical descriptions play for you in character development or construction, depiction.
Yeah, and I see some of the same things happening in your novel too. There's a wonderful scene of Anna trying to buy her mother a new winter coat at Saks. I won't ruin it, but it's maddening and wonderful at the same time. Jean is quite a character. But sure, that I mean the writer's obligation, the Conradian dictate that above all a writer must make you see, that our visual imagination is not being appealed to, we're not in the theater watching the movie and that's running in our brain as we read. So certainly the physicality of any character makes a huge difference in how the reader begins to imagine the character's life. And then, of course, multiple meanings, especially for women, again, women of this generation, when dress was so important. The corporate wife who, if there's a run in her stocking, it doesn't just mean that she got a run in her stocking. It means she doesn't care anymore, that she probably is angry at her husband, maybe that she drinks. All the armor that clothing can be, and also the idea of role playing. That's obvious. What you put on so that you look the part. That's very much, I think, a part of all women's experience, certainly at this time and place. I've actually had young people say, no, it can't be true that women wore stockings in Saigon in 1963 when it was 110 degrees to go to a party, and girdles and garter belts. And of course they did, and continue to for some years. But it's confining, but it's also in some ways opportunity for liberation, because you can change. You can take off one outfit and put on another. There's a scene in Absolution when Trisha and Charlene and Lee, who's a Vietnamese seamstress, go off to a leprosarium in Vietnam to do some good. They are do-gooders, and the GIs that bring them along give them army clothes to put on so that they can blend in. And it's transformative, it's freeing. Charlene says something about we look like the Andrew sisters on a USO tour, but it's very much a way for them to find another way of being in the world. So you have, both the visual and the importance of that, but also the significant metaphorical implications of what you put on, and what that says about your aspirations for yourself, or the
And I have a bit of this in Anna Turns as well, is that people's bodies, although we don't like to think about this, there is a way that bodies are the sand out of which personality forms. So you describe Charlene very early on as healthy, athletic in a genetic kind of way. And I wondered what you meant about that. And there was also, because it seemed very true, that Charlene's personality was very wrapped up in her having this healthy, athletic, genetic beauty and robustness that's different than Trisha, who's a bit more fragile. There's a character later on, the American doctor, who comes out of the jungle, filthy, dirty, huge, sort of reeking of sex. And one feels about him that there's something about his physicality and his body, that his personality was wrapped up in it, in the same way as Dom, who is a kind of boyish young man, and it seems as though his sweetness is also wrapped up in his physicality. And so what did you mean by genetic when you said that about Charlene?
I think for Trisha, I mean, Trisha sees that, there's a real class distinction. Trisha is a 23-year-old woman from a working class family in Yonkers, finding herself because she has married another working class guy, but someone who's on the rise into the upper middle classes or more because of his intelligence, and now because he's being used by the Navy. So she finds herself thrust into this corporate wife, diplomat wife, social world, um, and uh, and Charlene is very comfortable in that world. So Trisha sees it as it's a woman born to wealth who knows how to navigate what Trisha is only just shyly beginning to understand. And she sees it as she recognizes that this is a kind of a benefit that wealthy girls born to wealth have, as if it comes in their DNA. This comfort in the world, this ability to take on, to boss around, to be the smartest person in the room. Um, uh, so there's a real class element in Trisha and Charlene's relationship that I suppose has parallels in the larger Vietnam War, when it was a working class kids war.
Right,
So that tension is there between these two women.
right. And yes, and in Anna Turn, she experiences that with her sister-in-law, who's Catherine, who also has
Very
that
much so, right.
a horse and a silver spoon, 5 bathrooms in the house as opposed to the one where Anna grew up. And so, Allison,
Here's Allison.
I just want to remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I was so engrossed, I almost forgot to come back in because your conversation was so engaging, and we really appreciate that. Addressing not only your book, but the structure and the form, and talking about writing. So I actually have finished Alice's book, and I haven't quite finished Lisa's book, but I wanted to bring up a couple things in yours, Alice. One thing is, can you talk a little bit about the scene early on about the Barbie? I thought that was so interesting, and as someone who played with Barbies when I was young, the way you described it, I just completely related to it. I don't know why, it just struck something in me.
Thank you. I mean, who knew Barbie was going to be having her own movie?
Right. Exactly.
But again, it's 1963. It's the early days of Barbie, and it's in some ways it's the inciting incident that that brings Trisha into Charlene's orbit. Rainey, Charlene's daughter, has a Barbie doll that she brings to a garden party in Saigon. Trisha has never seen one before, but it's a way for the two of them to bond. And interesting enough, again, this is context. This is, women of a certain time and place. Trisha notes that that she's enchanted by the Barbie doll because she grew up with baby dolls. And all women, girls were expected to do was to be a mother and push the baby doll and give it water and change its diapers. And she's intrigued by the idea that this is a doll who can be many things. So even in 1963, when the Barbie was being introduced, we're back, Lisa, to the whole idea of clothing as offering possibilities. So Trisha sees this is a doll who, can be a career girl, a sorority girl. There's even historically accurate, there was an outfit called a Southern Belle, that she could be a plantation owner. But yeah, so there the Barbie doll as sort of artifact does return because a central event of the novel is that Lee, the Vietnamese seamstress, makes an áo dài, the traditional Vietnamese clothing, for the Barbie, which Charlene swoops down on and begins to sell so that she can make money to do her good works. But so Barbie is not the blonde bimbo that I don't think it's fair that her reputation went that way. She's the 1963 feminine mystique. You can be more than a mother.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Yeah. So, and then, so I am a 60-ish, 60-something woman. And I think it's interesting because as a 60-something woman, I've been able to grow up sort of thinking about reflecting on my life and my family, and it being acceptable to talk about things and talk about it with women friends, etc. And so what strikes me, and I'd love to hear from both of you, is the fact that, you know, in Lisa's book, she can do that and doing it at the end of her life, but could think about that in kind of, it almost seems like that's the logical step. Whereas in the 60s, the characters in your book, Lisa, Alice, you know, they don't do that. They don't feel like they can do that. It's not acceptable. And just how hard that would be, or how hard that was for so many women.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I love the conversations that Anna has with her friend Fiona, who's a real truth teller, and says things to her along the lines of what matters in a marriage is the authentic connection between partners, not whether or not anybody touches anybody else's genitals. So she's very bold in what she says. She has other aphorisms such as, you know, honesty is an overvalued virtue. It's nowhere near as important as kindness or respect. And so Anna and Fiona have this very open kind of communication, which I think may have been birthed out of the 60s and out of the women's movement and out of women. Charlene was a little bit ahead of her time in the way that she very boldly moves in to be intimate with Trisha, but she's also manipulative of Trisha.
Right.
So I'm glad that you recognize that, Allison.
Yeah.
I want to come back to Barbie though for a bit. Did you see the movie, Alice?
No, I haven't.
Well, because you love the opening, and the opening scene, Greta Gerwig really has very much an idea in sync with what you're talking about. In the very opening scene, these little girls have their baby dolls and they basically smash them. No more baby dolls. We want Barbie. We don't want to be just wheeling these things around. We want to dress up and fantasize about being an astronaut or the president.
Right.
But you know, it occurs to me though, I mean, you mentioned and it's in your lovely reading that Anna's in your novel trying to find a way to talk about her transitioning child, which is a kind of brave new world of language and understanding for her, has its parallels in that earlier generations, women trying to find a new way to talk about their own lives. I think there's, it would be interesting 25, 30 years from now, will Anna's questioning and the struggle that she seems to have in out of love for her child, is something going to happen? Will he be safe? Will she be happy with her decisions? Might seem from another era. In the future, when no, we're all good with that. We all know transgender people. We all understand what happens. So it is that sort of generational. We think we know so much better than women who came of age in the 50s and the early 60s know about. But we should look to the future and think, and how much are we so sure about, or are we so uncertain about that will seem astonishing in the years ahead.
And there's a good deal about marriage and parenthood in both of our books that is generationally linked. You have this wonderful scene where Trisha's father is sending her off on what he thinks is a car trip just to visit a friend's family. And he has to come out and check the oil, and he wouldn't even say goodbye to her unless he has a fresh shirt on. And Anna's mother, Jean, who's of the same generation as Trisha's, well, I guess as Trisha and Charlene are, that she herself views motherhood as pretty much the goal is just to make sure your kids are fed and housed and make it alive to age 18. And so the idea of what being a parent is for Anna is really very radically different.
Yeah, it's interesting because you used that word help me earlier, Lisa, and I had never heard it until I read the book, and I looked it up, and it has biblical connotations.
Mm.
And then, ironically, after I started reading the book and I saw that word, I began to watch The Gilded Age, which I don't know if either of you watched it, but it takes place in the late 1800s, and that word comes up a lot in there. So I think it's so interesting. It's like, and in a way, things didn't change that much from, the 1800s until really the 1960s. And it's amazing how long it took for women to, not have to just be there for the man, for their husband, or, their father or whoever.
Right. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was really Alice's word, but in Absolution. But why don't you talk about it, Alice, the help me, because it's an important
Yeah,
concept.
and it does have that biblical and archaic echo to it. But I think it was really important to me. And again, this is about our certainties, our present certainties, and how they'll look in light of future certainties, and also the certainties of the past and how we judge them. So it was really important to me to try to understand that when Trisha's father tells her on her wedding day, be a helpmeet to your husband, be the jewel in his crown, and she says, I will. She does that in a sincere belief in the importance of that role. So it was really important to me to try to understand sort of what was beneficial, what she enjoyed and found stirring about that role, rather than that kind of presentism that we can apply to even something that only happened a few decades ago, that you idiot,
Yeah.
you fool, why didn't you object?
Well, I felt like that came across really well. When you said that, I thought, well, yeah, that's what was important then.
Yes, yeah, and there were
Other-
benefits. Yeah, I mean, even as an old woman, she says, you know what? I was really happy as a newlywed. I don't know anybody who, I'm not sure that the other generations had that kind of joy that we experienced. So it's that respecting, and in some ways, I think in Lisa's book, it happens too, that uh, you know when Anna sort of comes to terms with her mother and who she was,
Mhm.
a woman who raised her two children without any help from a philandering husband, and did keep them fed and bring them, and especially the mother's very proud of the success of Anna's brother. And a kind of respect for that when you put it in the context of the entire life that this woman, rather than judging the past,
Right.
a sense of understanding it. And as Lisa said, which brings you towards a sense of forgiveness.
Yeah,
Um,
Lisa, can you talk about that a little, about Anna?
Sure. And well, first, I just want to comment on what Alice said. I really did love that the narrative perspective in Absolution is sincere, that Trisha is not looked at with condescension. And one of the things that is very beautiful in the depiction of her early days of her marriage is she comes to her marriage as a virgin, and she loves sex. It depicts that
That
she
was
loves
great.
her early marital sex, and that part of that is dependent upon in fact that she has a lot of leisure time,
Yeah.
she's very rested in the evening, not coming home from a job in which she's all worn out. She's had time to take a nice bath. And so it does, you do show the complexity of it. So circling back to Jean, I think what happens in the book is that Anna um comes, it is as though it is like a lightning bolt that happens on that day, but it consolidates for her about her mother, that there was actually quite a bit to admire about her mother. Her mother, who had been a model, a catalog model, not a super successful one, basically says, nah, this is not for me. I'm not going to starve myself. I'm going to get a major in math at City University. And I'm going to become an actuary. And she actually does not want to be a helpmeet. Her husband wishes that she would be a helpmeet, but she is not a helpmeet. She does not turn a blind eye to his philandering, and she goes on to support her children as best she can. So although she has many flaws, as you can see in that opening scene, and we see throughout the book, there are things that Anna comes to see that are worthy of her respect towards her mother. So I think Jean is less happy than Trisha, but she holds her head pretty high for in terms of what she's accomplished in her life.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to have to end at this point, and I'm so hesitant because it's been such an engaging and delightful conversation. I want to thank you both, and it certainly has, I'm sure, incited people to want to purchase the books. I have both of them behind me, both gorgeous covers. We have Absolution and Anna Turns. So again, please, you can support us by purchasing the book online, calling us, coming in the store, saying hi, or you can pop into your local bookstore if you're not nearby. I want to thank you all so much. It's so appreciated that as authors, you take the time to talk to us, and for our viewers to spend some time seeing what authors have to say about their books and their craft. So I just want to wish everybody a happy, healthy, safe holiday and new year. And we look forward to seeing what you guys have coming up next.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Alice. And thank you, Alice. And
Thank you.